On September 30th, 2011, the world was introduced to the plane of Innistrad. This gothic horror set not only captivated players with its aesthetic and its design and the mechanics, but brought us some multi-format staples that we would see for a very long time after the release of the set, with cards like Snapcaster Mage, Past in Flames, Geist of St. Traft, Delver of Secrets, and the unfortunate protagonist of our story. A card that arguably was considered one of the best planeswalkers of her time and continued to be up until, the releases of Modern Horizons, where we started to get like Rendon 6 and some very powerful planeswalkers started to really get printed, and honestly was the poster child of a lot of successful mid-range decks in the modern format and really across like other formats as well. So today, our unfortunate protagonist, our subject for today's video, is Liliana the Veil, and going over exactly why she was considered to be one of the most powerful cards in some of the most powerful decks and some of the most nostalgic decks that we have seen in Modern. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk Liliana the Veil. So here we have Liliana the Veil, our planeswalker that is so synonymous and definitely is a card that people think of, and one of the first three cards people think of when you talk about mid-range decks in the 2010s era of Modern. Kind of like when you think of when you see the big red subscribe button right next to my channel to support my content. If you like watching this video, then I'm sure you'll like any of the other Modern and Pioneer videos and other longer form type content that I post. So if you want to support my content, an easy way to do it: subscribe, like the video, ring notification bell so you know when other videos get posted, and join the Discord server in the link down below. Oh, look at that. That's pretty seamless. I might actually be getting good at this. What's not getting good is Liliana the Veil. So we recently saw Liliana get printed in the Brothers War sets, leading up to Phyrexia All Will Be One, things like that. And I remember seeing this card getting a reprint and like my jaw hit the floor. I mean, this was a card that historically for a long time, like once it kind of got its foothold in Modern as, this crazy mid-range card, and it was just so good. It was so good back in the day that it commanded like, an $80 to $100 price tag, and it even got printed multiple times in master sets, towards the end, and other things like that, really, before we had master sets replaced with, Modern Horizons and stuff. Like, this card just never dropped in price. Like, there was multiple different printings of Liliana the Veil in this iconic art as well, and players just gravitated towards it. I mean, it was just always expensive, always very expensive. And I'm going to hope that I can paint the picture today and kind of get some of the newer players to understand like why Liliana the Veil, like when it was like spoiled to be reprinted, that it was such a big deal for this card to be reprinted. And honestly, I thought it was going to be pretty good in Pioneer. Maybe not as dominant as it once was, where it's definitely not going to be towards the top of planeswalkers that you play in the format, but at least kind of getting to hopefully flex her muscles again and prove that she is one of the best planeswalkers, that's ever been printed, really. And of course, I would never throw that term around loosely anyway. So Liliana the Veil, being a 3-mana planeswalker with 3 loyalty, that could +1, each player discards a card, -2, target player sacrifices a creature, -6, separate all permanents target player controls into 2 piles. That player sacrifices all permanents in the pile of his or her choice. And I cannot tell you how many times that I play in paper and I audibly say out loud, if I've ever seen a Liliana Ultimate, that I designate like the fact that it says the pile that you choose, that player sacrifices it, is so confusing. Like when you play online, you just don't think about it, because a lot of the times, like when you choose a pile, like someone is acquiring that pile. So I always instinctively think, like, because of cards like Fact or Fiction, something is separated into piles. Like you pick the pile, you get those cards. But in Liliana's case, when you play online, the one that you choose is the one that gets sacrificed. So I feel like a lot of time, I mean, and now in the grand scheme of things, like it's not really going to happen all that often, But and if you have a player that's like pretty good at like making piles and stuff, like whichever one that you end up getting to keep is like almost irrelevant, or like only changes slightly how like the game plays out, but like by and large, like you're still very much behind at that point. Even if it's just like all lands, like you just get Stone Rain for like 4 or 5 of your lands, like that's still like pretty good. That sets you pretty far back, especially considering the decks that you are playing against when you're playing against a Liliana. But anyway, like bypassing all of that, when we think of, Jund back in like the, the mid 2010s, 2013, like 2015, even like the 2016 and stuff, Lightning Bolt was a very popular card. And of course, damage spells and stuff work differently because we had like the redirection roll and stuff. But Liliana the Veil, the fact that you could play this and then plus it up to 4, it was immediately out of bolt range, and you kind of want to be doing that anyway because you were going to pressure your opponent's hand. We went over some cards that are in the Jund archetype, and really a lot of Jund cards from back in the day could end up in this series. We might even see a few more, but you were playing like Dark Confidant with cards like Liliana the Veil, so you were kind of getting some card advantage, and you were able to plus Liliana, and you really weren't going down on total cards. Like maybe you would be like -1 card after playing your land, playing a spell, and then plussing Liliana, but your opponent was going -2, -3 over the course of a whole turn cycle because of them wanting to play their spells and interact with the board, and also getting their hand pressure from Liliana the Veil, which created a lot of scenarios where players were essentially empty-handed, and Liliana's kind of just got to plus for free. And I mean, as we get later on into like the history of Modern and what was going on, and what made Liliana even more powerful was that you were able to kind of like mitigate the discard. It had the symmetrical effect where like, yeah, both players are putting cards into the graveyard. But when you remember, Innistrad was a set that introduced flashback to the format and everything. I mean, it was just as simple as like, if you put flashback cards in your deck, you just got to discard them, and you virtually had access to them, granted sometimes for a higher cost, but it was essentially a free discard because you were going to keep the card anyway, barring any graveyard interaction from your opponent. So really, like the +1, it was very easy to kind of break the symmetry in that way. Of course, your opponent could do the same thing, but by and large, like, you were able to play around your own Liliana's discard better than your opponent could play around Liliana's discard effect. The -2 definitely worked out pretty well, like in those situations that we've created where both players are low on resources in terms of like what's in their hand. Looking back at Jund, later on in Jund's life, they got like Abrupt Decay, you have like Maelstrom Pulse, you had Lightning Bolt. Later on, we end up getting Fatal Push, things like that. These cheap interactive, removal spells. And Liliana's like Sacrifice was like a way that you could kind of beat some of the other evasive threats, or like hexproof shroud threats and things like that. Like Boggles ended up being like a pretty big deck that people like to play just because you made like a big thing, and a lot of decks just had no way of dealing with it. They just got beat down by a 13/13 vigilance, lifelink, trample, first strike creature that they were just never going to beat in combat, and even if they blocked it forever and it didn't have trample, etc., you were eventually going to lose to it because they had like 80 life and they were eventually going to find a Rancor, whatever. Liliana was one of the ways, and one of like the removal spells for that deck, that you could actually interact with like a Boggle in that way. Obviously not directly, but it was like a way that you could do that. And again, we've kind of listed some of these examples of how Liliana is just so powerful to begin with in that way anyway, that it just kind of added, this extra layer of what made this card really good. You even had times, and I've seen on like streams and stuff, obviously way back when, like Star City Games and things like that, where players would play like a Liliana, and then they could minus target themselves, and then they would sacrifice their own Dark Confidant if their life total was low, so that they didn't die to their own Dark Confidant, flipping potentially another Liliana the Veil, Maelstrom Pulse, or even other 2-drops like Tarmogoyf, Terminate, things like that. So definitely understanding like the mid-era of mid-range decks where like Jund was like the big thing. Liliana fit into there very nicely because Jund was like this super grindy, nitty-gritty, like, we're going to play dirty in a legal way. Obviously we're going to play dirty, and we're going to essentially run you out of things to do, and when we're top decking, my top decks are going to be a lot better than yours. And then once you kind of shift farther into the format, where we kind of get to Khans of Tarkir, where I believe that's like 2015-ish, era, we start getting Siege Rhino, which then ended up making Abzan at least a hesitation for Jund players to like, hey, do we play white or do we play red? And Liliana kind of got to again flex the muscles of being able to play into the symmetry of the +1 ability by getting to play like Lingering Souls, which ended up being very good in the format, just because no one could beat through Lingering Souls. And like if you just got to play one and then flash it back and then also follow it up with like a Tarmogoyf or whatever, you had 4 flying power in the air, and then you had like a 4/5 power ground creature. And like if your opponents like wanted to get rid of a spirit token, like they basically got rid of a fourth of a card. So I mean, just crazy to think about. And of course, like Siege Rhino kind of leading the way, and Liliana just getting to get in there because again, just the fact of being symmetrically very powerful fits into the game plan of, hey, we're going to grind you into dust, we're going to run you out of resources, and you're going to have to beat my very efficient, powerful creatures with limited resources. And in an era where not everything had draw a card on it, where they've had a way to replace themselves either when they die or things like that, Liliana was even more effective in making sure that your opponents really couldn't get anything going. Moving even further, I mentioned Mardu Pyromancer and Liliana the Veil, again, just being the creature that kind of, was a big piece of the puzzle. Granted, in a deck like that, we had seen Faithless Looting see a resurgence in play. Well, not even really a resurgence, just like a surge in play, I guess, is a little bit more correct, where you could fill up your graveyard, you could play cards like Bedlam Reveler and things like that. And Liliana, again, you could discard those Faithless Lootings and you could end up casting them later. You could fuel your Bedlam Reveler by getting rid of spells that really just didn't matter in certain matchups. You got to go wide with like Pyromancer, so you're able to protect your Liliana, and again, just kind of getting to the point where you can ultimate this card and just completely blow your opponent out. Play like Blood Moon in your deck, and then like having a Liliana plus a Blood Moon in play essentially means that like your opponent's going to end up getting rid of like the good cards in their hand, so that when they eventually blow up the Blood Moon, if they're even able to, if you don't win the game by then, they essentially don't have any haymakers left to throw. They're just like completely gassed at that point, and Liliana is just like that extra like chokehold on the game. So definitely understanding like there's a theme behind why Liliana is so good, and it's the fact of breaking the symmetry of the card and being able to play into the discard as much as possible to make the downside of the card as much of a non-downside as possible. And of course, players got smart by being able to do that, playing some of these flashback spells in like Abzan and Mardu, and then in Jund just being able to have kind of the way to keep up in terms of card advantage with it. As we got later on, of course, Ikoria came out, the pandemic and everything, but when we started to kind of like lift sanctions and Magic tournaments were starting to go on, I had a friend of mine who loved playing Jund, decided to build Jund, and there was definitely some actual discussions of players either playing Liliana the Veil or playing Lurrus. Now, if you played with Lurrus, Lurrus is insane. I mean, I played Grixis Shadow, and Lurrus was just awesome. From beginning to end, Lurrus was great, and it was just always worth playing. And the fact that Jund had the capability of playing Lurrus and getting to play a lot of powerful threats, even getting to essentially play Death Shadow in like your Jund deck and everything, and kind of play into it. People still argued about playing Liliana the Veil. Even in that time, she was that good. Or at least where players were willing to kind of look and give her the nod over playing the busted card Lurrus. Of course, at least in my opinion, I think that was probably incorrect. It was probably just worth it to play Lurrus instead of playing Liliana the Veil. But that was discussions that did happen at the time, and I think is worth noting to kind of paint the legacy of Liliana the Veil, where just being so much of a staple, so much of a card that when you think of the mid-range archetype, this is the card you thought of. This is where it started, and this is where it ended. And my god, was she just so expensive all the time. I remember going to a game store and they had one stickered for like $60, 60, $70, and she was like 100 at that point. And I remember like, man, that's a heck of a deal. I'm gonna go buy one. And they ended up changing the price to like $100, whatever. And I couldn't afford it being like a broke college kid, but that was just, I was like, man, like I want to own this card just because it is so iconic for that format, and it's just at the time, I mean, like 2015, 2016, just a very, very good card and a very nice one to have at that in your collection. So hopefully all of that kind of puts into perspective exactly what we're dealing with Liliana, and probably starts to show why in 2023 going into 2024 we don't really talk about Liliana the Veil, in Pioneer, in Modern, in Legacy, anything like that. So of course I get to do the dirty deed, and I've kind of put it on myself in exactly explaining why this card does not see any more play. Well, for starters, Lingering Souls isn't playable in Modern anymore, which is unfortunate because it's easily one of my favorite cards and has one of my favorite like promo arts to play in the format. So, unfortunately, Lingering Souls not being very good, Faithless Looting being banned, so the Mardu Pyromancer decks are a lot worse, on top of some other reasons too. And Jun just has a lot of other things going on that it would rather be doing than playing Liliana the Veil. Now, it does play it, I believe, in like 1 or 2 copies, but I mean, we were used to seeing 3-4 copies easy all day. Like this was a 4 of in all of your Jun mid-range decks, almost no matter what configuration you were playing. And of course, like when Bloodbraid got unbanned, just living the dream of Bloodbraid into Liliana the Veil to kind of like relive some nostalgia, if for what it's worth. So here in 2023, coming into 2024, too many cards just replace themselves. A lot of Liliana's power comes from being able to slowly whittle away at your opponent's hand, and again, you just being able to kind of capitalize on that fact by your cards just in general being more efficient, more powerful. And while you would think in a format where like, okay, well, if they're playing cards that whenever they play them, essentially you get to draw cards, like you could do the same thing and then Liliana still gets to do it. The problem is that when players are still getting to kind of like play other things and draw their cards, whatever, you have games that go longer where your opponent has something to do with the cards in hand. Obviously we've gotten more, man lands that we've seen more play like as recently as like Lost Caverns and Ixalan that see a decent amount of play, at least in like the Pioneer format. You have so many other cards that just do more, cards that interact a lot easier with planeswalkers, definitely just more hard removal for like that permanent type, more damage dealing spells. It just doesn't have enough loyalty to kind of like stack up and protect itself from the ever growing efficiency of creatures. I mean, I know we have Tarmogoyf as like the ultimate efficiency creature, but the fact that, for Rakdos in Pioneer, has 2 mana 3/2s, 3 mana 4/3s, 3 mana 3/3s that can flip into 4/4s, and you have Smuggler's Copter now, which is like a 2 mana 3/3 that just get, just all of that, like just more efficient creatures just from that archetype in general. Phoenix just getting to put a bunch of 3-power flyers into play that also don't care about Liliana minus, and of course in a deck that doesn't care of having their cards discarded from their hand, because they're just going to end up discarding Phoenixes and end up getting them back a lot sooner and punishing you for playing Liliana instead of interacting with their graveyard. So all of this combined with the fact of formats getting faster, cards becoming more efficient, cards just becoming better for their cost. I mean, in Modern we see it where there's these 4 and 5 mana cards that are seeing play, but they do a lot more than what this 3 mana planeswalker does. And like Omnath, Locust Creation, you get paid off by getting to not only draw a card, it's a 4/4, it's a big body, and then its landfall abilities just allow you to cast more spells, cast more expensive spells for that matter. And of course, like slowly kind of chip away your opponent, deal with their planeswalkers, things like that. We see the pitch elementals where, they're pretty good when you get to hard cast them, but when you just get to cast them for their alternate costs, they end up being even better in a pinch. in terms of like being able to interact with your opponent, and of course so good that one, possibly two of them should have been banned, but one for sure, in Fury getting banned. Beanstalk, another reason. I mean, like, could you imagine playing Liliana the Veil while Up the Beanstalk is legal, and people are just playing Bloodbraid Elf into Shardless Agent into Up the Beanstalk and getting to cast Furies and Solitudes and draw 2, 3, 4 cards while you're just trying to play Liliana the Veil and just in general play mid-range. So definitely a knock towards our mid-range queen here. I mean, really, like, it's a shame. It's really a shame because of just how iconic this card is. And I know for a lot of players, just wanting this card to be good, and definitely would have been a card that I would have wanted to see printed in Pioneer, when of course we know that it has been printed in Pioneer now, or in any site where it's Pioneer legal. And I thought it would at least been a pretty good role player. I remember even making a video and I thought, man, Liliana the Veil is going to be awesome. And it just has not had the impact that I thought it would. And I think even, I believe it's even still standard legal, and it's not, not seeing like too much standard play. At least I don't believe it is. But for the purposes of our channel, Modern, virtually no play. Pioneer, virtually no play. It's unfortunate and really a shame that Liliana the Veil, after its dominance in Modern, being a pretty good card for, all things considered, in a Legacy, and of course even like Standard at the time, and getting to kind of be in the same set and be considered one of the best cards in a set that, like we had mentioned in the beginning, was printed in the same set as Snapcaster Mage, printed in the same set as Past in Flames, which was a Storm staple for Modern and Legacy. Even to this day, a Storm staple in Legacy. Geist of St. Traft was like a staple creature, and all these different things, from arguably one of the most popular sets ever printed. We got one of the most popular Planeswalkers, one of the most popular mid-range options that we could have gotten, really from that entire set, and for even a while after. Liliana was the gold standard of Planeswalker for a mid-range deck. Made the way for Wrenn and 6, where now Wrenn and 6, I would argue, is the kind of like the poster child of, mid-range decks nowadays. Where, these 4 or 5 color control decks, whatnot. And of course Jun picking up and being an early adopter of it as well, to pair with Liliana the Veil, because then you could just play your land, whatever, pick it up with Wrenn and 6, discard it, you virtually just, went 0 on cards, but, got your opponent down 1. Now we don't see it anymore. It's not something you see, it's not something that's particularly powerful anymore, and as we kind of go on, it doesn't look like there's any signs of Liliana the Veil coming back anytime soon, unless you play in like some weird like variations of like Modern formats and stuff like that. So unfortunate, that's where our story ends. There is no happy ending for Liliana, and really no happy ending for anybody who ends up in this video series, but it's kind of fun to kind of go down memory lane and kind of see how the decks that are built around these cards change, and kind of the direction that formats go and things like that. And I really hope that you all enjoyed watching this video, enjoyed talking about Liliana the Veil, how she was impactful. I mean, beyond impactful, honestly. Again, like, really probably one of the greatest Planeswalkers for that 2010s kind of run ever printed, at least in the argument for top 5, top 10. And again, I'm sure that's not going to cause any arguments at all whatsoever, but very powerful card. Unfortunate it doesn't really see any play anymore, but hopefully this nostalgia trip for a lot of you has been enjoyable, and I look forward to other players that might have some pretty good Liliana the Veil memories. Would be really nice. I had like a few people from the Fairies video kind of like give me some insight on like that format and things like that, so I would definitely appreciate it if you shared your Liliana the Veil stories. I love to read them, I love to interact with people, talk about it and that, so of course please do so. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, other Modern and Pioneer content. Ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Go into the links down below. You'll see a link to the Discord server. Join over there, and I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video.